Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those listening from overseas. Thank you for sticking around and listening. Especially like to say thanks and hello to my sister, who I believe is listening in online. It's always cool when family gets to listen to this. And one final piece on family. For those of you that can see my bio wherever it's located, you notice the last line in it talks about my wife, my son, and my daughter. I bring that up only because we start looking out to 2035 and 2040. Both my son and daughter by then will be in their 20s and 30s. So they'll be the adults leading into this next generation. So all the work that we do here trying to help describe this for our different governments, our different militaries, really has an impact on our children as they go forward, and hopefully my grandchildren, if I'm so blessed, farther down in the future. What I'm going to be doing for you today is starting off by discussing TRADOC G2's assessment of the operational environment, and then moving into a quick discussion on how we came up with that assessment. And this is actually part of it. You'll see where events like this are incorporated into our process. And then finally go over some of the things that we're seeing in the operational environment today, kind of what it means for us, and what we're presenting to the Army as the discussion of the operational environment for the Army in the future. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show is a video that we've put together that talks about what the operational environment is. It's our foundational assessment for what is held in this document. I'll make another pitch for the OE and Changing Character Future War, which there's copies of out there. For those online, you can get it from the MadSci page, like Lee has been saying this whole time. Mr. Greco's down in front. He's my boss. He'll sign it if you're here and you want him to. It'll be worth a lot of money later. But let me start by saying, what is the United States Army's definition of the operational environment? It is a composite of the conditions, circumstances, and influences that affect the employment of capabilities that bear on the decisions of the commander. So when we say operational environment, we're talking about those things that a commander has to take into account before he or she makes decisions about the application of force within a certain theater. So this is obviously scalable. The operational environment I'm talking about today is mainly operational to strategic, but you can see that G2s down the line to the tactical level can also describe operational environments at a very minute, exquisite detail for their commanders to be able to make these decisions. With that, if you can please play the video.
I would put Russia right now from a military perspective. I would put
As
Russia
the number
right
one
now
threat.
from a military perspective.
I would also add
as
the number one
China,
threat.
North Korea.
I would also add
China,
ISIS,
North Korea, along with Iran, and ISIS.
While the United States has been engaged in counterinsurgency operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, our adversaries in the Middle East and Afghanistan, our adversaries have made other investments that are as multiple layers of standoff capabilities that are as good, or in some cases, among the most critical areas of adversary investment. Among the most critical areas of adversary investment, integrated air defense, electronic warfare, counterspace, and integrated air navigation and timing, counterspace, cyber, precision navigation and timing, recon, cyber and social media complex, recon information strike complex, massed artillery and fires, use of UAVs, protection, massed artillery and fires, deception and ambiguity, proxies, CBRN, deception and ambiguity, CBRN, WMD, the Big Five. But as we learned when we fielded the Big Five, materiel is by itself not decisive. Capabilities require a modernized approach across doctrine, organization, training, leadership and education, science and technology, personnel, leadership and education, policy, personnel, experimentation and learning, policy, experimentation and learning. When we apply this lens to the operational environment, we find our most capable potential adversaries are Russia, both Russia and China possess capable militaries. Both Russia and China possess capable militaries in terms of many similarities between the two, in terms of their focus on area denial, anti-access capabilities that focus on standoff, their ability to challenge us across all domains, their ability to challenge us across all domains, and their sophisticated approach to cyber and information operations. Military research and development. Both also have robust military research and development, focusing on technology acquisition capabilities, focusing on a range of advanced capabilities, artificial intelligence, including hypersonic, directed energy, artificial intelligence, advanced human performance, and railgun computing, advanced human performance, and quantum computing, largely come in three areas. But the differences largely come in three areas: geography, capacity, Over
and
the
capability.
past 3 years, in a series of war games,
Over the past 3 years,
simulations,
in a series
and
of war
tests
games,
against
experiments,
the anticipated
simulations, and
adversary of
tests
2030,
against the
Army has
anticipated
identified
adversary of
several key
2030.
gaps, which
The
must
Army
be
has
addressed
identified
and
several key
eliminated.
gaps which must be addressed and
If the
eliminated.
United States is to prevail over our adversaries,
If the United States is to prevail over our adversaries, we require the proper capabilities that are positioned during the competition period, that are able to effectively integrate
challenge
with
our
whole of government
adversaries across
capabilities,
increasingly
designed to
complex
challenge our
diplomatic,
adversaries across
information,
increasingly complex
military, and
diplomatic,
economic spheres.
information,
China
military,
and
and
Russia will
economic
continuously
spheres.
exploit the
China
conditions
and
of
Russia
the
will
operational environment to achieve their objectives without resorting to armed conflict by fracturing the U.S.'s alliances, partnerships, and resolve. They attempt to create standoff through the integration of diplomatic and economic actions, unconventional and information warfare through social media, false narratives, or cyber attacks, and the actual or threatened employment of conventional forces. And if we should find ourselves in a conflict, we need to prevail in all domains in an environment characterized by the potential for overmatch and standoff operations in complex terrain, contested in all domains across the full spectrum of operations, where cyber increases the momentum of human interaction, but where the soldier and leader remain the decisive edge of the decisive force.
So the placemat we have here goes along with the video, and so I won't go into all detail on the slide because it was contained in the video. I will hit a couple key points that the video did not discuss. The first one on the left-hand side of the slide, as you look at it, talks about those key systems that our adversaries have been improving on. I've been in the military for 19 and a half years now. In those 19 and a half years, probably at least 17 of them have been focused on COIN and CT operations. We've been focused on small unit and soldier protection. We've been focused on targeting networks or individuals. What that's necessitated is a heavy reliance on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's required us to have strong air power at our beck and call almost immediately to either take out a target or get us out of trouble, the classic TIC, troops in contact that we know from Afghanistan and Iraq. Our adversaries, having examined that, have looked at that as a way to improve their strengths against our perceived weaknesses. Our adversaries now have systems in the electromagnetic spectrum from strategic to tactical that can challenge us. Where we focused on countering IEDs, they focused on countering command and control systems. Where we focused on identifying radio chatter, handheld push-to-talk microphones, they were working on jamming strategic communications from satellites. They also looked at integrated air defenses, and again, integrated air defenses from strategic all the way down to tactical to man-pads. The point behind those being to separate our forces, separate the air from the ground force, to prevent us from, to control one domain from another domain. If they can control the air domain from the ground with these IADs, they're fracturing the joint forces capability. It's been talked about a lot today, information warfare and unconventional warfare, enabling plausible deniability, or at the very least injecting uncertainty in a situation that causes us, our allies, and our partners to give pause before acting and making decisions. All of these taken together provide our adversaries select cases of potential overmatch. They use this overmatch to create standoff. The standoff is not only physical, but it's also virtual. They're looking at separating us not only from air to ground, like I mentioned, but separating us from our allies and partners through political means, through the information warfare. If we move over to the right-hand side where it talks about the two pacing threats, Russia and China generally approach warfare in a similar manner. Neither wish to engage us in direct conflict, but instead rely, as we've discussed at great length today, on actions short of armed conflict to achieve their objectives. They exert power across the spectrum of national power. We look at it from the DIME perspective, diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And we're not making the case that China and Russia have different or don't have capabilities in one of the DIME spectrums. They both do. It's a question of, if you look at the capital letters DIME, it's what size font do they use for that letter. The Chinese probably have a much greater font, letter E, than what the Russians do. the Russians probably have a great larger font M for military than what the Chinese do. They also both possess the capability to contest us in all domains, which is something we are not used to. And they continue to be a nuclear deterrent. As the video mentioned, the three major differences are geography, capacity, and we term competence and momentum. When you look at geography, the European area of responsibility is approximately 1/6 the area of responsibility in the Indo-Pacific. And for the Army especially, that creates great challenges for logistics, command and control, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. With respect to capacity, while our two adversaries generally field systems with the same capabilities, the Chinese economic prowess has enabled them to field a lot more of those systems. Finally, with respect to competence and momentum, the Russians have enjoyed several years of operational experience ranging from Chechnya to Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea, and now Syria. And they take those lessons learned and incorporate them back into the force. China, on the other hand, hasn't seen combat since Vietnam. Our senior intelligence officer over in Building 950 likes the trivia question of how many Chinese officers have combat experience, and the answer is 1. They are, however, seeking ways to overcome these challenges by conducting exercises with the Russians, by going on UN peacekeeping missions, and conducting realistic training within their own area. We look at the center pane in the map. It's not intended by any stretch of the imagination to portray every area where we expect to face China and Russia in competition and/or conflict. It's more showing the fact that our two adversaries are global in nature and that we see them in greater geographic areas than ever before. Excuse me. Finally, the stars on the map represent potential areas of conflict and also historical areas of conflict. One thing we would like to point out with China is we always tend to focus on the South China Sea scenario, but they continue to have border skirmishes with places like India that could always quickly escalate and embroil American forces there. Moving from what our foundational assessment of the operational environment is into the process, how do we come about the operational environment? With everything we do, we ground ourselves in policy from the national and Army levels with the contingency plans and operational plans of the force and defense planning scenarios. We then take everything we get, the guidance we receive from there, and we start with the intelligence community. And we take a look at what the intelligence producers for the United States and for our allies say, and we view through the lens of our threats. As you heard General Milley say in the video, that was probably one of the best things that happened for the intelligence community was that laser-like focus on the 2+3 adversaries. But because the intelligence community is limited in the confidence of its assessments beyond a certain time frame, we then come to events like this, where we reach outside of the Army and we attempt to do what we're doing today, where we get different perspectives. The Mad Scientists event, our partners and allies who are providing this input. We take that, and that leads us to create trends and drivers, and I'll talk about those a little more. We've had a lot of discussions of trends and drivers, and they are very similar across the board. But we take those and put those into our war games and scenarios and exercises, and that helps us to test and validate our assessment of the operational environment. But like all good intelligence officers, our work isn't done there. We have to continually inform this cycle, and every year as we keep learning new things from events like this, from things we learn in war games, we go back, incorporate that back into our assessment of the operational environment and continuously move the cycle forward for our customers. We've talked about the trends. Mr. Grubbs had these listed at the very beginning as the drivers of change. We have 12 up here that we've listed, and again, we've talked about a lot of these in great detail. The boxes you see around, the colored boxes you see around there show how we've nested our trends within the national intelligence communities for mega trends, if you will. We use these to monitor our progress and update our running assessment as necessary, with a specific look to the impact of these trends on military operations and the operational environment. We're specifically concerned with the convergence of some of these trends and the coevolution of technology. If you look in our OE and Changing Character of Future Warfare, we talk about an era of contested equality, where technology is changing so rapidly that no one adversary may have a strategic advantage over another for very long. I look at some of these, like cyber, from my own experience in the military. As I mentioned, I've been in for 19 and a half years. My first job was a field artillery platoon leader in Germany. In my platoon of 32 soldiers, we had one computer for the entire platoon. And when evaluation and award time came up, it was usually pretty hectic trying to cycle all the section chiefs and platoon sergeant myself through to do all of that work. Now when I go into my office, I have 2 computer screens, access to at least 4 different computer systems at all classification levels, 2 telephones, one of which actually plays video when I turn it on, and I can see the other person on the other end. So we talk about these trends. That's 19 years worth of technological change and a change in human-computer interaction. The video I'll play next is something we showed General Milley that talks about the change of trends over the 35 years. When we played this video for General Milley, we reminded him that 35 years is the amount of time it took him to go from being a second lieutenant in the Army to being Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And I'll harken back to my comment I made at the very beginning. 35 years from now, if my son chooses to follow in my path, he'll probably be a company commander or a battalion XO or S3. What will the impact of these evolution of these trends mean for him if he continues to follow in my footsteps? So with that, if we can play the video, please.
What do you consider the greatest threat the United States of America faces?
I would put Russia right now from a military perspective as the #1 threat. I would also add China, North Korea, and ISIS, along with Iran.
Just as we are looking forward, so are potential adversaries. Russia is aggressively exploring remote combat operations. Here is a Russian simulation of their future combat unmanned ground vehicles operating in a contested urban environment.
So this is the vehicle that you saw in the video, the Russian Uran-9. For those that may not know, this video has actually been used in Syria. It's been shown in their May Day parade. It's something they're seeking to alleviate some of the demographic problems that they're having by going from a force that requires 3 people to operate this to 1 person to operate 10 of these. If you get a chance, go to YouTube and search that video. It's much longer and shows that the mission that set of vehicles was on was actually a Kazovac mission. They were going to rescue a Russian soldier, take them back to the garrison. The body count, I think, of U.S. equipment they finally took out was, I think, 4 tanks, 3 fighting vehicles, and 2 Apaches, all with a team of about 4 of those unmanned autonomous vehicles working together for one Kazovac mission. So pretty neat concept for what they're trying to do with this and how they're thinking about it. What I'm going to use that to segue into is my next slide, which talks about the conditions in the environment. That is an example of what you see in the upper left-hand side of robotics and autonomous systems for battlefield advancements, excuse me. When we talk about the conditions or the characteristics of the future environment, we discuss the increased speed of human interaction in events, the potential for overmatch and being contested in all domains that I've touched on, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and then operations among populations and in complex terrain. The video is another example of operations among populations and in complex terrain. I find it neat that if you look closely at that video, the street signs are all in English. In fact, one says old-fashioned barbecue. So the idea is that that conflict is happening on American soil over here. But I also like to point out some other things on the slide that others have touched on today. This morning, Brigadier General Brown mentioned increased lethality and it being like 4D chess. And then Colonel Merkins talked about the individualized warfare. He talked about it in terms of soldier enhancement and making a better soldier. I'd like to talk about it on the flip side of individualized warfare, striking the homeland or striking someone close to you. Thinking about it in terms of if my unit were to deploy, what's the chances of an adversary reaching down to Mrs. Tabor's Facebook account and putting false messages in there to detract from the home front. That has been discussed at some point in time today. It's just a point I'd like to bring back. We've talked at length about cyber today, but I think there's also a space aspect of it too. For both space and cyber from our near-peer adversaries, the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. They can reach out and touch us and prevent our forced employment, our forced projection, and can affect the will of the homeland. We've talked a lot today about affecting the will. That's another way to affect the will with a potential non-kinetic attack to prevent us from achieving our objectives in support of allies and partners. I'd like to use this to segue from the conditions within the environment to more of a discussion of what does this look like right now. What we see right now is great power competition as laid out by our National Defense Strategy. The current strategic environment is a state of continuous competition by great powers. And these great powers, Russia and China, pose 3 challenges to us. Tactically, as I've mentioned, they challenge us in all domains. Operationally, they employ multiple layers of standoff. And strategically, they leverage the competition space to achieve their objectives. There's examples of this under each one. You see for the bottom, the employment of new weapons systems. That's the standoff in all domains. When China puts an advanced anti-aircraft, advanced IAD system on an island, that pushes us back farther. We can't get in as close. When Russia deploys S-400s to Syria, that forces our OIR mission back. It limits what we can do in the air. Strategically leveraging the competition space, it's been discussed. Thank you to the Canadian officer. That was an excellent discussion. The one thing I saw during my time at the United States European Command was the introduction of the Enhanced Forward Presence Brigade in the Baltics, and how almost immediately, within hours of them arriving in country, there was a fake news report that came out about a German soldier raping a local national. It was proven false, fortunately, pretty quickly. We did a good job on that one. But just the rapidity with which that message got out, trying to discredit NATO within the host nation, was shocking. I think a lot of this goes back to what Dr. Lipke talked about, forcing us to lose before the fighting even begins. Again, our competitors don't want to fight us in a peer-on-peer fight conventionally. They want to keep us from getting to the fight, and they want to keep us from getting into the fight. I'll conclude with this slide that wraps up the things that I've been talking about. One more plug for the chairman, General Milley. Where you see underlines on this slide is when this was presented to him, he grabbed it and actually underlined these words because this is what was important to him as we go through. And it's the things that I've already talked about, those conditions in the environment and the conditions in how warfare will be characterized in the future. And as we've talked about several times today, not just the United States Army, but I think all of our nations find ourselves at this historical inflection point where we have to start making decisions and informing our leaders to make decisions about how, not how we fight now, but how we will fight and what we need to be in that next fight. And with that, I'll take any questions that anybody has. Thank you.
Lieutenant Colonel Tabor, I will give you your first question. You did a good job of intertwining some of the comments through what we heard earlier today. And one of the things I thought was very interesting is from each one of these countries, if I was to add up the time, I think I would have heard more about narrative warfare, truth, information operations, influence operations, in that kind of realm than I would have heard about great power conflict. But if I listened to your presentation, you touched on competition, influence operations, but it would be different. It was more about great power competition. Do you, I'm not asking you to speak for the Chief of Staff of the Army, but there is a difference there of, it seems like the countries we heard from are more talking about the activities we might consider to be competition and then into conflict, and more, this U.S. piece we're talking about is more about conflict, but with a little competition on the side.
So I think coming from the intelligence officer perspective, I focus in on the threats much more quickly. Combine that with being an Army officer, I jump right into the fight, into the conflict period. That's not to say any of the other stuff isn't important. That's just been the focus area for what I've been doing with my partners in the Futures and Concepts Center with our Unified Quest war game over the last year. It's not meant to discount it. Certainly, we are in conflict, we are in competition right now. That is happening globally. I think the other nuance to that is that our adversaries don't view competition the same way we do. Theirs is more of a squiggly line of where we are. The U.S. tends to view it as an either-or situation. We're either in competition or we're in conflict. And so I think one of the struggles for the United States, the Army, going forward is how do we compete, as was mentioned earlier, when we're an Army that's used to going to war?
So that segues very good to a second question. Are the conventional armies that we've talked about, are they becoming, the question is irrelevant might not be the right word, are they becoming less useful maybe to much of what we heard here described, speed of conflict, super empowered individuals, proxy warfare, information warfare? Are we preparing for something that is not really being described as much as being the future operational environment that we're hearing? Or are all these people wrong and really we're talking about peer conflict and competition alone in the future, or both?
I think one of the struggles we have is how do we view the military, especially the Army, how do we view ourselves as a deterrent force? What is it we do to compel deterrence? And if deterrence fails, then we have to win in conflict. And I think that we're struggling with that identity crisis because a lot of times in the Army we've said that deterrence, somebody else is doing deterrence and then they call us in at the end of the day to win the war for them. I go back to the discussion on the character and nature of warfare. I'm a firm believer that the character may change, but the nature will not. And so if you want to compel the will, I think there still requires that, especially ground force, to go in and take hold and seize terrain. it may be augmented, it may be supported, it may have capabilities such as AI, robotics, other things like that. But I think at the end of the day, it will come back down to a soldier standing on a piece of ground somewhere that will ultimately compel the will.
G'day. Can we go back a few slides to the map, please? I just want to highlight an observation and then probably pose a question. I wanted to get your thoughts. There's two key areas missing on this map, and you sort of highlighted the map can't sort of look at everything, and that's Antarctica and the Southwest Pacific. So both areas are subject to resource competition and predatory tactics from our adversaries, you know, in the financial and economic space and things like that. But also notwithstanding those effects that we're seeing at the moment on posed by climate change. When we look at the operational environment, we heard today sort of looking out to 2028, 2035, 2040 and 2050, we realise actually, you know, and it was a point highlighted by our Dutch presenter that actually some of our adversaries are thinking in terms of centuries. Do you think that only looking at the operational environment out to, say, 2040 or 2050 constrains our thinking? Do you think perhaps that we might need to start thinking about the operational environment in terms of centuries, like our adversary, and maybe we start to overcome some of these challenges that might seem actually objectives that we might seek to achieve in a short space in time, but actually there's a bigger goal in mind over a period of, say, centuries?
So I think that you're hitting on something that was actually one of the findings of the 9/11 Commission. You know, one of the findings was that there was a failure of imagination that led to the attacks happening and not being able to warn about that. And I think that's something we struggle with. I think culturally we've, at least the circles I've run in have talked about the U.S. Army, the Americans, we talk 10 years out and we're talking grand strategy. China talks centuries out and they're talking grand strategy. So I think it's a cultural, how do we get past that? How do we start to have those conversations? And I think what we're seeing, you know, to trumpet the team, I think the mad scientists are, for us anyway, at least starting to get at that, starting to bring those conversations in. When I first got here 2.5 years ago now, somebody mentioned railguns to me. My brain immediately went back to World War II with literally the cannon sitting on a rail car. But it was discussions with the mad scientists that started to enlighten me to what the realm of the possible was and start to break out of those mindsets and start thinking longer term. So I certainly think there's value in it. I think it's a struggle for us to break out of kind of the here and now, how we operate and have operated for a long time.
Anymore because you're being proclaimed Bob Tabor, and when he saw this, he's just like Serge. He goes, "Wait a second, am I getting proclaimed?" This now you can go put it. You don't know if you're on social media, but if you were, you could go put this on social media where a lot of them put. But you are being proclaimed Army Mad Scientist, signed by General Brown and Mr. Greco.
Thanks, sir.
There's the miniature of the poster, and you can put this up. Love stuff like this. All the kids love the Army Mad Sci swag. They just love it.